Today I want to talk about a rather difficult subject, and that's the subject of death, and particularly an untimely death, where somebody dies before they've had a chance to live a full life, or maybe even somebody that's older, but they die so suddenly that it just is a shock to everyone around them. Well, this is the type of thing that happens on a fairly regular basis, but it's something that happens only occasionally in our lives. And so while we see it happen around us a lot, it's not until it happens to us that it really hits home. In the last couple of years, I've watched a particular family go through this very thing. A friend of mine named Kelly passed away very suddenly. Now, he wasn't a young man per se, but he wasn't all that old either, maybe around 60 years old. Had children, 8 of them to be exact, had grandchildren, I don't know how many grandchildren, but he just died all of a sudden. And it took a while for his family to be able to deal with that, as it does all of us when this happens. Well, that was 2 years ago, and now they're finally getting past that. And then one of his daughters passed away in an auto accident. She was just a little over 30 years old, but she left behind 5 children, young teenagers, and a fiancé, and of course siblings and a mom. And again, because it was an auto accident, it was something that was completely out of the blue, completely unexpected. It's the type of thing, when you hear about it, it just takes your breath away. Now, this particular girl, Mary, I think of her as a girl. Obviously, she was a grown woman, but I had the privilege of coaching her from the time she was in 3rd grade through the time she was in 6th grade in basketball. And so I got to know her really well. She was a sweet young lady. And I got to know her family really well. Matter of fact, they moved across the alley from us for a while when their house on the other side of town was damaged in a tornado. And so they moved just across from where we lived for a little bit. And we certainly got to know them even better during that time. And so had the opportunity to really get to know them, but also because of that closeness, had the opportunity to witness a very difficult time for that family. What do we do? How do we handle situations like this? And if you're like most people, it will not be as well as you'd like, but you really do the best you can, don't you? I think it's times like this that we have to be on our guard because of the difficulty that we go through. Sometimes we tend to blame God for this, and sometimes we tend to think that He owes us an explanation for what's happened. You remember the account of Job. In the Old Testament, we read of a man who had 7 sons and 3 daughters who were all killed in a tragic accident. In addition to that, he lost all of his wealth because raiders from surrounding areas came in and stole all of his livestock. And then on top of that, his health was damaged so significantly that he was just in continual agony. And he got to the point where he wanted an explanation from God, in fact, demanded an explanation from God. Now, Job was a righteous man. I don't want to pick on Job at all because I'm sure Job did far better than I would have done, and maybe he did better than you would have done under the same circumstances. And what he did was very human in wanting to know why this happened, but it also demonstrated something that is a trap for us when we find ourselves in similar situations, because sometimes we blame God. As you read Job, you find out very specifically that this was something that Satan did to Job, not God. But Job didn't understand that. Job knew that God had the power to stop anything bad happening from him, and God had blessed Job's life very richly throughout his time here on earth. And he was let down when God didn't protect him from some of the things that everybody else goes through. And again, he thought it was God that was doing it to him, but it was actually Satan. And so he said he wanted to talk to God. He wanted to question God and make God give him an explanation for the reason that he allowed this to happen to his family. And as you know, if you've read the book of Job, God did give Job that opportunity. And when he spoke to Job out of a storm, his presence was so awesome, and the conversation was such that Job realized that he had overstepped his bounds, that Job at one point just said, I closed my hands over my mouth. And then he said, surely I spoke of things too great for me to understand. I am convinced that all of us get in that situation from time to time. And very often it's at times of our highest levels of grief that we do that. Things happen that we don't understand, and we're confused, and we're hurt, and we're angry, and we want someone to aim that anger at. And very often it's God, which is sad because God is the one who is actually there to help us through the most difficult of situations, not to put us in these situations. There's a couple of examples that come to my mind whenever I think of something like this. One is an example I've used for other topics, but I think it fits very well in this one. It's an example that Zig Ziglar gave, the motivational speaker. And he talked about a large town in the Midwest that was growing. The only problem was it was growing towards where they had the city dump. For the longest time, this dump was located way outside of town, and it wasn't a problem. But as the town got bigger and bigger and bigger, it started growing in the direction of that dump. And so the city leaders got together, realizing they had a problem, and they tried to come up with some sort of a solution to what could be a really bad situation. And it's interesting to look at their solution because it tells us, I believe, within that example of how we can handle difficult things. And so the first thing they decided to do when they were looking at this dump was to stop dumping garbage. Now that may sound too simple, but it's a point that many people never get. Sometimes our lives are just filled with problems, and we just keep compounding those problems because we keep dumping the same garbage into our lives that brought us the problem in the first place. And sometimes it's not something that we brought on ourselves, but we compound it by bringing garbage into the situation. So the first solution for them, or the first step in their solution, was to stop dumping garbage. And the second step was just as important. They removed all the garbage that they could take out of the existing garbage dump. And they moved it far, far away from town to where it would never be a problem again. And then after they had done that, they filled the rest of it with clean fill dirt. And they put a foundation over it. And then they built a shopping mall that employed hundreds of people and serviced, I suppose, millions of people through the years. But wasn't that an intelligent solution? When you look at it, here we've got a problem, but they turned that problem into something that was actually a blessing. And there's something very instructive in that for us, because again, there are times in our life where we're just kind of out of control. We find ourselves in the middle of a garbage heap that maybe we weren't responsible for in the first place, but maybe we add to it, maybe we compound it. And so we need to stop dumping the garbage, and we need to get rid of everything that we can so as not to be impeded by it. And then if we're wise, we'll do something great with the opportunity that removing the garbage has created. The other example, the other illustration is a true illustration of a man that I knew. His name was Jack. Jack was a preacher when I came to know him, but he was just a regular person, just like you and me. Most preachers are. Grew up in Colorado. He married his high school sweetheart, Nancy, and they had several children, one of whom was Chris. And Chris ended up getting polio. Their sweet daughter ended up with a crippling disease. And Jack and Nancy watched Chris as she struggled and deteriorated and went downhill with this terrible disease, certainly that nobody had brought upon her. Wasn't any fault of anybody's, but there it was. Well, how do you deal with that? A lot of people blame God when bad things happen, especially to their children. Well, his run of bad luck, if you want to call it that, didn't end there, because years later, his wife Nancy, his childhood sweetheart, developed cancer. And it was a very particularly painful type of cancer. And he watched her suffer for a long time before she finally succumbed to that cancer. Well, by that time, Jack was preaching, and he decided he could not continue in that employment because his wife Nancy was such a big part of his ministry. All of us who have preached, I think, realize that, how important a good supportive wife is to the work that we do together. And so he took up painting. It was a hobby that really turned into something that helped him to heal from some of the things he had been through. And he was so good at it that people started clamoring for his art. We've got several of his art pieces in our house that we received from him because he was such a good friend. And what he did was he opened up a little gallery. I imagine he used most of his life savings to do so, and it just didn't make it. And so I don't believe he went bankrupt, but certainly his business failed, and with it took an awful lot of his life's earnings. Well, how do you deal with that? On top of that, one of Jack's passions in life was fishing, and he passed that love on to his son, and he had several grandsons who also enjoyed that, and there was a particular event, a vacation that they had planned for a while, where Jack and his son Dave and two of his grandsons went fishing near Yellowstone, Wyoming, at Jackson Hole, or just around that. And it was certainly a beautiful time, a time that they had not only looked forward to, but it was a time they were enjoying. And then a storm blew up on that lake. It's a pretty cold area. The waters are frigid, and before they were able to get back to shore, that boat capsized. And so there they were in that freezing cold water. And the two young boys, they just couldn't make it. Instantly, they went into shock. And so Jack and his son Dave spent, I don't know how long, diving underneath those freezing waters, trying to find their grandsons, trying to rescue them, but it was no use. Finally, there came a point where both of them were just exhausted and victims of hypothermia. And Jack said he looked across those waters and saw his son Dave's eyes, just hopeless, utterly defeated. And then Dave sunk into the waters. He died. All three of them died. Only Jack was able to get to shore and survive this. It wasn't too long after this event, maybe not even a year, that I had the privilege to hear Jack preaching, and he actually spoke of this for one of the first times, I believe, that he was able to do so. And as he was preaching, we had invited him to our congregation to give a gospel meeting, and he was talking on the topic of prayer. And he kind of paused during one of his sermons, and he said, you know, there are some mornings when I get up that all I can think to do is to go before God and say, thank you, thank you, thank you, Father. Thank you for all that you've done for me. Now think about that for a moment. How can someone who had been through so much, who, if anybody, had a right to question what had happened to him, why God would allow something like this, such a series of events to happen to their life, surely it would be Jack. And yet here, when he goes before God, he goes before him in thanksgiving. How could that happen? And it's just this. His daughter Chris, the one that got polio, lived. She's now probably close to 70 years old. I hope she didn't mind my saying that. And she has not only survived, she has thrived. Her polio clearly affects, or the effects of it clearly affect her life. But it's not her life. She's married to a really good guy, has a wonderful son, a wonderful daughter, beautiful grandchildren. She's lived a full life. And she has her faith. She's a Christian. She's happy. The whole family is. Jack's wife was a faithful Christian, and Jack fully intended at that point to be able to see her someday in heaven, if he could just be faithful, because it appeared to him that she had been faithful, and that there would be a reunion someday if he could just keep his end of the deal. His business was just his business. When it failed, it really kind of propelled him back into preaching where he needed to be. He's a man who has a tender heart, or had a tender heart. I have no idea how many thousands of people he introduced to the gospel of Christ, and showed through the living of his own life that you can overcome anything with God's help. His son was a good Christian. He expected to see him again. His two grandsons were of that age where you recall Jesus' comment, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. Well, these are just little children, so he was confident he would see them again as well. And he just lived his life after that. He preached, he got to the work. And then as chance would have it, he acquired cancer himself. A little after he turned 80 years old, he died of that cancer. And yet, he died filled with a hope and an expectation, because he knew this world was not all there was. He was living for something else. He was waiting for the real life that God's created us for, heaven. Who knows what wonderful things God has in store for us there? Who knows what kind of a grand reunion we're going to have someday with our loved ones who've gone before? You see, this is how we handle such difficulties as some people seem to go through. I don't know if I could handle it half as well as any of these people that we've talked about today. But I do know that God is always there, in case I have the wisdom to be able to lean upon him in bad times as well as good. And if I can be thankful to him, just as thankful during the bad times as I am the good. Jesus said this. It's found in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus wants to help us through this life. God desires to help us through this life. They don't cause unnecessary pain in our life. Why things happen to good people, I don't know. All I can say is the right thing to do is to turn to God for help, not to turn against him in accusation. If we can do that, we can get through anything with God's help and with the help of good friends. And someday there will be a reward waiting for us in heaven, not because we're so good, but in fact because God is so good. And we've just done our little part. How do you get through bad times? Well, you get through them by leaning on God, not by turning against Him. It's a good lesson, I think, for all of us. Well, thank you for listening today. I appreciate your watching this video. If it helps you and you think it might help somebody else, share it with them. Like the video. It'll help it to get around to more people if it needs to get around to more people. But again, I appreciate your watching today, and I hope we'll see you tomorrow. God bless.